with Potomac Beads. Join me in making this Colette Rope, which can be used as a bangle bracelet, a necklace. You can do it as a wrap bracelet as well, featuring some easy steps in herringbone, working with tubular herringbone, as well as then going into peyote and then quickly back to herringbone. Gather up your materials, and if you need any, check the links below and we'll get started. For the Colette Rope, you want to keep in mind that this can be done as a necklace, as a bracelet. You can change up the difference, or the distance rather, between the beads as you're working with it, as well as the amount of beads that you put before the crystals. So I just wanted to show you quickly the most simplistic materials that you need as you're working with it. You're going to want some 11 OC beads, and here I have the Duracoat Galvanized Champagne color that I'm using in the example here, and then 8 OC beads, and these are in the Crystal Lab Full. These are both Miyuki brand seed beads, but the nice thing is this pattern will not be affected if you use Toho or Miyuki brand. I'm also using 2mm Bicones. So these are Potomac crystals in 2mm jet. You can see you can also go festive, changing up the colors, or even doing a design that's all different crystal patches along it. Whether or not you want to do this as a bangle bracelet or as a rope necklace, that is going to be your decision. You're probably going to want to make more than one. So what I'm going to do is show you how to get started on the ladder stitch. And then we're going to go from ladder stitch to doing herringbone stitch. We're going to switch after herringbone stitch with the 11 OC beads to the 8 OC beads, and then we're going to actually do peyote stitch as we add crystals, and then quickly go back into our herringbone stitch. Gather up your materials, and we're going to get started on this fun, easy design. So to begin my rope, I'm starting out with a size 12 beading needle and some 0.006 Wildfire beading thread. You can use a bigger needle, but honestly, as you're working with it, you can kind of sew through the actual rope portion and the herringbone portion faster if you have a smaller needle. So a size 10 needle will work, but I have a size 12 on. This pattern, because it is tubular, like most tubular patterns, take a lot of thread. I'm going to start out with approximately 5 feet of thread and leave about 12 inches before a stop bead. We're going to begin with ladder stitch and 2 rows of ladder stitch to start on our herringbone. I'm going to begin with 2 of my champagne colored 11 OC beads, and I want to let them drop down next to my stop bead. Grabbing 2 more, I'm going to ladder stitch. I'm going to go into the opposite side of the 2 beads that my thread is currently coming out of and sew in to the top since the thread's coming out the bottom. What this is going to do is push those 2 beads to sit right on top of one another. Go ahead and sew back through the 2 beads that you just added, and my thread is going to come out towards the top there. 2 more beads get added on, and I'm starting at the top there with that thread. I'm going to sew into the bottom of those same 2 beads. The 2 beads I added sit right next to those, and then I sew through those 2 beads in order to add the next ones. Now you'll notice every other row of your ladder stitch, your thread is going to exit your beads at the top one, bottom the next one. So we're at the bottom right here as we add the 2 beads and sew into the top of that row. When we exit row number 4, we're going to be at the top. We're going to do row number 5, sewing 2 beads, going into the bottom now, and then going through the 2 beads you just added back to the bottom. We're going to do 6 rows because we are going to do 3 rows of herringbone stitch. There's going to be 2 groups or 2 rows for each grouping of herringbone. After you have the 6 rows of your ladder stitch on, we're going to make this tubular. So I'm going to sew from the last row, row number 6, into row number 1. This is going to start near the stop bead because I'm coming out the top right there. I'm going to go into row number 1 from the top bead down towards the bottom. That's going to round this out into a tube. So you can see those 6 beads kind of lined up. Go back up through that last one right there, back through 6. And then to start you can either go back to 1 or back up through row number 5 like I'm going to do. So that way I go back away from the stop bead. The stop bead is going to be the end of the rope. We're going to continue on, and that's why we went back up an extra row. From here, we're going to start to look at each of these 6 pieces or these 6 groupings of our ladder stitch as groups of 2. So here I am coming out of bead number 1, and that's bead number 2. My next grouping, 1 and 2. My next grouping, 1 and 2. With herringbone stitch, you're always going to add 2 beads at a time. I'm coming out what I'm going to call bead number 1 of my side 1, and I'm going to sew down through bead number 2. I'm only sewing down through 1 bead of the ladder stitch beside. Going over then, I'm going to go to my next group of 2, and I'm sewing up that first bead in that next group of 2. Again, 2 beads go on. I'm coming up bead number 1. I'm going to sew down bead number 2. And just down bead number 2. Now again, I'm going to my next side of my herringbone stitch, side number 3. I'm sewing up bead number 1 there. Once I come out bead number 1 there, I'm going to add 2 more beads and sew down through bead number 2. Each time I add on to my herringbone rope here, I'm going to be adding 6 beads per row. Whether I'm adding the 11s or the 8s after a little bit, it's always 6 beads. After that section, I need to step up to add my next kind of level on my herringbone rope. I'm going to step up by going through the next bead number 1 from that second row there that I was going through, and I'm also sewing through the first bead that I added in this previous row. That's called a step up. Now, just so you can see that step up, I'm going to switch to 8/0s. I would recommend that you do a long piece. We're going to do about 13 stitches, or you can do shorter if you want to have it go a little faster. But I'm going to switch just for a row to the 8/0s just so you can see that herringbone again. I'm going to come out of bead number 1 on this first side of my herringbone, those groupings of 2. I add 2 beads, this time they're 8/0s, and I'm sewing down through bead number 2. The one that sits right next to it. You can see those beads like kind of right on their side. I'm going to spin this in my hand to the next side of this tubular herringbone, and I'm going to sew up through bead number 1 on this second side. Coming out there, I'm going to do 2 more beads and sew down through bead number 2. If you're struggling with this at all, before attempting tubular herringbone, it's always nice to learn regular herringbone before doing it. I have tons of videos to teach you that herringbone stitch. Coming out of bead number 2 from side 2, I'm going to sew up bead number 1 in side number 3. 2 more silver beads go on, and I'm sewing down bead number 2. So you're always up bead number 1, sew down bead number 2. Now I obviously need to get back up to the silver top in order to add my next row. To do so, I'm going back to side number 1, up bead number 1 from that side. So there's bead number 1 from that side. And I'm also sewing up through my first silver bead that I did on that row, through number 1. And that brings me back up to the top. From here, you're going to continue on with this tubular herringbone stitch for the number of rows that you want to do. In the Christmas color variety here, what I did was a series of 7 rows of my herringbone stitch in the 11L before I went into 8s, or then where I'll show you the transition into the crystals. Here on my champagne one, that's going to be my necklace versus my roll-on bangle, I am doing 13 in between my crystal groupings. So I want you to go ahead and create a row whatever size you want it to be. I'm going to suggest 13, it's a nice good number, that you're going to create your row of your herringbone stitch with just your 11 O's to create that first tubular section here. Once you create that first tubular section, I'm going to show you how to step up and add these larger beads and then go into our peyote stitch to add our crystals. When you're creating the rope, if you have trouble remembering when to step up, what's going to happen if you forget is you're going to start to spiral and get a spiral herringbone. So what you can look for as ways to remember whether or not you've stepped up is that you should see a thread connecting each side of your 3 sides of your herringbone rope. That's when you know that it's time to step up, is when that you see 2 back or pull the thread straight across. You can see that there's no thread in that section. There is one behind it and one on the other side. Oh yeah, I need to connect that section. You can also, if you really struggle, knowing when to do that step up, and you're always going through 2 beads then, the first bead that you were coming out of when you started that row, as well as the first bead in your new row that you just added. If you need to and you have trouble remembering that you need to add and step up, you can always look back in the design too and just put out piles of 6 seed beads. After the first couple times, you'll realize it and you'll get ready then to do your step up, but you can pile them in groups of 6. So that way when you get through, and you see, I usually sew down bead number 2 and up bead number 1 of the next side at the same time if I can. Make my beads sit so they sit in that V section. Add 2 beads, down bead number 1, up bead number, down bead number 2, up bead number 1 for my 3rd side. And then once I'm done that 3rd side, I sew down bead number 1. And then I realize, oh, I've used all 6 of my beads, and I need to sew up through bead number 1 anyway, which is actually 2 beads below. I'm going to sew through bead number 1 from side number 1, as well as bead number 1 from the new row that I just added. And that closes it up. Also, herringbone is always going to look disconnected and almost kind of like the end of a sea creature fanning out there before you go into your next row. When you add your next row on, it seams up the previous row and really closes up that gap. You'll notice even more as you go in and add the larger beads, that effect, but by that time you should totally have the design element. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 rows on. I want to do 3 more rows of the herringbone stitch, and then I'll switch over to my 8s. After my 13 rows of my 11 O's, I'm going to switch over to 2 rows of my 8 OC beads, adding 2 8s as I come out bead number 1 from side number 1, going up bead number 1 from side number 2, adding my 2 beads, down bead number 2 from side 2, up bead number 1 from side 3. When you add in the 8s, just make sure kind of they're sitting on their side there. 2 more beads go on. I go down bead number 2 from side number 3. And then looking over, I need to step up. So I need to go back through bead number 1 from row number 1, which is going to be the gold bead, as well as bead number 1 from the row that I just added, the silver. Now you can stop after here if you want to, and you'll get that rope effect where you have just 1 bead before the crystals. I'm going to do 2 beads before the crystals to make it a little bit more dramatic. So I'm going to do 1 more row of my 8 OC beads, add 1 bead, sew down bead number 2 and up bead number 1 from side 2. 2 beads go on, down bead number 2, up bead number 1 from side 3. 2 beads go on, down bead number 3 or bead number 2 in side number 3, and then I need to go back to side number 1, up bead number 1 from that row that I'm coming out of, as well as up 1 bead, the first bead that I just added on this row. I'm now going to switch to peyote stitch. So I'm going to add 1 bead in between my herringbone. So instead of adding 2 beads, I'm adding 1 of my 2mm crystals in the jet color. So I'm coming up bead 1, adding 1 2mm bead, sewing down bead 2, coming up bead 1 of side number 2. Instead of adding 2 beads like normal herringbone stitch, I'm just adding 1 down bead number 2. Side number 3, up bead number 1, just adding 1 crystal down bead number 2. Closing that off and joining these 2 rows together, I need to go up through bead number 1 on that same row, so that's that first silver bead that my thread was coming out of. And then also I need to step up through my first bead there, which is my crystal. Now I'm going to switch to peyote stitch. Sewing through a bead, add a bead, into the next one. Add a bead, into the next one. So you're adding 3 beads of the jet per row. Add a bead, sew through the next bead. So it's setting me up for this tubular peyote stitch. Now I need to step up, back through bead number 1 of those black beads that I just added. I'm going to do 1 more rotation here with adding in 3 more beads, add a bead, skip the bead that's next, and sew into the second bead from the row you just added. Add a bead, skip the bead underneath, and sew through the third bead that you just added. Add a bead, skip the bead below, and sew back through that first bead that you added in the previous row. I again need to step up, so I'm going to sew through my first bead that I just added in this group of 3. You're going to end up with a total of 9 beads in the center that look like a little bit of a peyote stitch. After here, I'm going right back into my herringbone stitch. I'm going to do 2 beads and sew through bead number 2. So this is setting me up for it. Coming out of that black bicone then, 2 silver beads, and into bicone number 2 from the last row that I just did. 2 more beads into bicone number 1. Sorry, that was into bicone number 3, into bicone number 1. So you can see then that sets up that you have in between each of those last 3 bicones, you have 2 of your 8 OC beads. Now what we're going to do is downgrade. So I want you to sew through 1 of your 8 OC beads, and now we're back to herringbone stitch. Add 2 more 8 O's, sew down through bead number 2, and up through bead number 1 on the next side, which is going to be your silver bead. Again, add 2 more beads, sew down through bead number 2, and up through bead number 1 on your third side. Sometimes you can do this at the same time. Sometimes it doesn't want to cooperate. You just take it out there and go right back up. Now I need 2 more beads added on, and then I'm back to my gold beads. 2 more 8s get added, down through bead number 2, and when I come back again through that first side, because I just added my 6 seed beads, I'm going back into bead number 1 from side number 1, as well as through bead number 1 from the new row that I just added. So it's looking like you're stepping up through 2 beads. Now, after 2 rows of 8 OC beads, I'm right back to my 11 O's and continuing on. 2 beads go on, coming up bead number 1, so down through bead number 2. Up through bead number 1, side 2. 2 11s go on, down through bead number 2. Up through bead number 1 on side 3. 2 beads get added, down through bead number 2 on side 3. And you can see how I rotate and spin it in my hand as I'm working with it. And then when I go back over, I need to go back to bead number 1 on side number 1, which is going to be that silver bead, as well as up through the first bead, that first champagne bead that I added in this new row. Give it a nice tight pull. You can see how that's going to join them together, and then you're just continuing on with that same repetitive stitch. 2 beads and back to that tubular peyote, tubular herringbone stitch. So the beads get added in the middle of the herringbone stitch for the bicones, much in the form of peyote stitch, and then it's an easy transition back into herringbone when you add the bigger size. Stepping up then, I'm going right here into my first and second bead of that herringbone, and then back to it. You're going to have a long rope that just keeps progressing and progressing and progressing that you're wearing with it on. Remember, you can do less space between your crystals if you want to, which will actually make it go a little bit quicker. You can also do just one row of 8 seed beads. You can do the holiday colors. You can change it up. I'm excited to see it in silver with some different colored crystals in the interior as well. And I'm just going to keep building and building and building in true rope fashion. It's going to take a little time to get the length that you need. When it comes time to kind of close up your rope and add the clasp, I'm going back to the starting side and coming out the rest of my ladder stitch there. I'm coming out one of the beads at the end. I'm going to add one 8 seed bead and sew down bead number 2. Shifting over to the next side, I'm going to sew up through my 11 last bead of my ladder stitch, add one 8, sew down the second bead. Again, sew up, and that's my start thread there. I added a new piece because I didn't leave myself quite enough room. Add one 8, down through, and then so basically we're reversing this same technique that we do in order to add the crystals. I'm then going to go up through bead number 1 that my thread was just originally coming out of. Once I exit through bead number 1, I'm going to catch on here to my first of my 8 I'm going to add a couple of my 11 now too. So I'm going to go in and go just like we did with the crystals where you add one in between each bead. I'm closing up this rope, adding one 11 and sewing through to the next 8. To close it up even more now, I'm going to step up by sewing through that first 11 that I just added, and then I'm going to add one more row of my 11. So just like we did with the crystals, I'm doing this now switching over to this peyote stitch with my 8 and my 11. That helps to close up this herringbone rope gap. After sewing through and adding one 11 seed bead in between each of the previous 11s, you can see how it just makes a nice little finished end there with one row of silver and then 2 rows of my gold. To finish it off and to make it really closed, I'm going to step up and I'm going to sew through all 3 of the last gold beads that I just added. That closes up my rope completely. From here, I'm going to grab out my clasp, and I'm using a 14mm push clasp. I want to be able to use this at the front or put it in the back, but since this necklace is going to take a little bit of time, I want to make sure to use a nice clasp. So I'm going to glue my Rivoli into my 14mm setting here, and then after that, I'm going to add my clasp. Generally, that's kind of my method of choice that I would recommend. So I am going to get ready to add in my one side of my push clasp. So I take out the little tongue right there. This is a pretty little clasp, garden clasp. I'm going to grab out one of my wire guards or wire protectors. And because you're using gold and silver potentially, it doesn't really matter which one you're using. Coming out of that first 11 seed bead, I want you to go up through a wire guard or wire protector, add your thread down the other side of the wire guard, right there. Take your clasp and make sure it goes through the loop of that wire guard as well. And then I'm going to sew back into bead number 3. So I'm coming out the right side of bead number 3. I'm going to go into the right side towards the left of bead number 3. That's going to keep it kind of consistent and equal along the edge there. Go back into bead number 1 now. Back now into bead number 2. And once you go into bead number 2 here, you're going to go into the wire guard, side number 2 that we went into from the other direction. And that'll kind of help to even it out. Up and around the wire guard, down through the wire guard on the other side, making sure your clasp is there in the middle, and out the other side. From here, looking at the ends, I'm going to go back in now to bead. So you can look and see where it's coming out of the wire guard. I'm going to go back in now to bead number 3. Once I'm in bead number 3 there, you can see I did a nice tight pull, and it sits pretty much in the middle between those 3 beads. I'm going to take my thread and needle now because I did have to add thread because I didn't leave my recommended 12 inches. And so back down into the project here, get to my thread end and tie off the thread ends and burn. When I get finished with the other side, and honestly I'm just taking a little break from the other side and decided to do the clasp because I am about 10 or 11 inches into my 18 inches of my rope. So thought I'd take a break, add the clasp, and then I'll continue on with my rope to finish off the project using the exact same technique to attach the clasp on the alternative side. Thanks so much for joining me in making this fun Colette rope. Remember, it could be a bracelet, it can be a necklace, you can do it as a bangle bracelet, seaming the ends together as well. If you do need any supplies, make sure to check out the links below to shop with us online at PotomacBeads.com as well as PotomacBeads.eu. Remember also you can give a little thumbs up to let us know that you like this type of video, as well as subscribe to get regular updates from us here at Potomac Beads. As always, thank you so much for watching the Colette rope, and I can't wait to see all the different examples and the styles that you guys create as you make it your own.